He was a broken-down 80-pound liability with a graying muzzle and a rap sheet. The shelter staff warned he was aggressive. Donovan just thought adopting him was a massive mistake. But that was before he unbuckled the German Shepherd's heavy leather collar and saw the words carved underneath. The shelter smelled like bleach, trying to cover up despair. It was a sharp chemical sting that hit the back of Donovan's throat the second he pushed through the glass doors, mingling with the unmistakable odor of wet fur, cheap kibble, and concrete dust. Above him, fluorescent lights flickered, emitting a low, incessant hum that vibrated right behind his eyes. It matched the ringing in his ears, the permanent parting gift from a mortar shell in Helmand 8 years ago. Donovan stood in the lobby, shifting his weight off his bad right knee, already regretting the drive. His therapist had suggested a dog. Routine, she had said, leaning forward in her expensive leather chair, her voice dripping with that practiced, sterile empathy he despised. You need something outside of yourself to keep alive, Donovan. Something to ground you. He didn't want to be grounded. He wanted to sleep for more than 3 hours a night without waking up in a cold sweat, his hands searching the empty mattress for a rifle that wasn't there. Can I help you? The girl behind the counter looked to be about 20. She wore a green polo shirt with the shelter's logo and a plastic name tag that read Chloe. She looked at him with polite customer service apprehension. Donovan knew what she saw. A guy in his late 30s who hadn't shaved in 4 days, wearing a faded gray hoodie over a frame that was still heavy with muscle, but carried rigidly, like a coiled spring, rusting in the rain. I'm looking for a dog, Donovan said. His voice was gravelly, unused. An older one. I don't have the patience for a puppy. Chloe's posture relaxed slightly. We have a wonderful senior section. Are you looking for a particular breed? A lab, maybe? We have a sweetheart named Daisy. No, Donovan interrupted, his tone flatter than intended. Show me the ones nobody wants. The ones that have been here the longest. Chloe blinked. The bright, practiced smile faltered. Oh, well, we have a few long-term residents. Come on back. She led him through a heavy metal door, and the noise hit them like a physical blow. It was a deafening cacophony of barks, whines, and frantic claws scraping against chain-link fencing. To Donovan, it sounded like panic. It sounded like a holding area before a bad extraction. He walked down the center aisle, keeping his eyes forward. Dogs hurled themselves against the kennel doors, spraying saliva, desperate for eye contact, desperate for a hand. Donovan ignored them. It felt cruel, but he didn't have the emotional bandwidth for their frantic, needy energy. He felt suffocated by it. They reached the very last row, designated by a faded red sign that read, Behavioral Special Needs. The noise thinned out here. Chloe stopped in front of the second-to-last cage. This is Dutch, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if afraid to wake something. Donovan stopped and turned. The kennel was Spartan, just a raised plastic cot and a stainless steel water bowl bolted to the chain link. Lying on the concrete floor, ignoring the cot entirely, was a German Shepherd. He was massive, but skeletal. His coat was a dull, dusty black and tan, patchy in places, revealing raised, hairless scars on his hindquarters. His muzzle was frosted with thick white hair, making his face look like a ghost's. His left ear was torn at the top and flopped lazily to the side. The right stood at rigid attention. The dog didn't get up when they stopped. He didn't even lift his head. He just shifted his eyes, the color of dirty copper, and stared at Donovan. It wasn't a pleading look. It was an assessment. Cold. Exhausted. Exhausted. What's his story? Donovan asked, his voice low, matching the dog's stillness. Chloe wrapped her arms around her clipboard. He's a retired police, K-9. Narcotics and patrol, we think, though his paperwork is a mess. The department he worked for got disbanded or restructured. His handler passed away off-duty a few years ago. Since then, he's bounced around. 3 different homes, 3 returns. Why? He's difficult, Chloe admitted, shifting uncomfortably. He's not outwardly aggressive, but he guards. Doors, hallways, his food. If you corner him, he'll snap. He doesn't play. He doesn't want to be pet. The last family said he just paced the house all night, doing perimeters. He terrified their kids. Honestly, his time here is limited. He's shutting down. He hasn't eaten his kibble in 2 days. Donovan crouched down, ignoring the sharp protest of his knee cartilage. He brought his face level with the chain link. The shepherd let out a low, rumbling huff. Not quite a growl, just a warning. Stay back. He's institutionalized, Donovan murmured, mostly to himself. He recognized that look. He had seen it in the mirror of transient barracks and VA hospital bathrooms. It was the look of a creature that only knew how to exist in a state of hypervigilance, and when the mission ended, there was nothing left but the wiring. The dog wasn't being malicious. He was just trapped in a war that was already over. Donovan didn't baby talk. He didn't make clicking noises with his tongue. He slowly extended his right hand, pressing the flat of his palm against the cold metal wire, and held it there. 5 seconds passed. 10. Dutch didn't move. He kept his head flat on the concrete, but his nostrils flared, taking in Donovan's scent. Sweat, stale coffee, Old Spice, and the underlying metallic musk of adrenaline and fatigue. Slowly, agonizingly, the old dog pushed himself up. His back legs trembled slightly before locking into place. He walked toward the front of the kennel, his head held low, his steps heavy and deliberate. He stopped right where Donovan's hand pressed against the wire. He didn't lick Donovan's fingers. He didn't wag his tail. He simply turned his massive head and pressed the side of his scarred muzzle heavily against the chain link, right over Donovan's palm. A heavy, dusty sigh pushed through the dog's nose. Chloe gasped softly behind him. He's never done that with anyone. Donovan pulled his hand back, stood up, and wiped his palm on his jeans. He felt a tight, uncomfortable knot pull in his chest, an emotion he immediately wanted to push down and suffocate. He was an idiot. This dog was a liability. He couldn't even take care of his own houseplants, let alone an 80-pound traumatized predator. "Get the paperwork," Donovan said, not looking at Chloe. "I'm taking him." The adoption process was a bureaucratic nightmare designed to make him quit. Donovan sat in a cramped office under a ticking wall clock, filling out a stack of waivers. The shelter manager, a stern woman with reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, sat across from him, detailing every reason why this was a terrible idea. "You understand he is a bite risk, Mr. Vance," the manager said. "Wait. No." Donovan looked at the paperwork. "Donovan, read." "I understand," Donovan said, pressing the cheap ballpoint pen into the paper hard enough to score the desk beneath it. "If he bites someone, animal control will seize him. We cannot take him back a fourth time. This is his final strike." I said, "I understand." Donovan slid the papers back across the desk. "Can I get my dog now?" They brought Dutch out on a heavy slip lead. Out of the cage, the dog looked even worse. His hips were narrow, his gait stiff. Around his neck sat a thick, faded leather collar that looked ancient, the brass buckle oxidized green. Donovan took the lead. He didn't pull. "Let's go," he muttered. The walk to the truck was an exercise in tension. Dutch didn't pull on the leash, but he didn't heel either. He walked at the end of the line, his head swiveling constantly, ears scanning the parking lot. A car door slammed 3 rows over, and the dog dropped instantly into a low crouch, eyes locked on the source of the noise. "Stand down," Donovan said quietly, opening the rear door of his battered Ford F-150. Dutch hesitated, smelling the interior. It smelled of old tools and dust. With a grunt that sounded painfully human, the dog hauled himself up into the back seat, curling immediately into a tight ball on the floorboards, ignoring the actual seat. The drive home was silent, save for the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers. A cold, gray rain had begun to fall, smearing the city lights of Seattle into blurry streaks. Donovan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He glanced in the rearview mirror every few minutes. Dutch hadn't moved. Only his eyes tracked the passing streetlights, glowing amber in the shadows. Donovan lived at the end of a cul-de-sac in a house that looked aggressively unlived in. The lawn was overgrown, the blinds were drawn, and the porch light was burnt out. Inside, the living room contained a worn leather sofa, a television resting on a milk crate, and a coffee table littered with empty mugs and mail he hadn't opened in weeks. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open. In. Dutch stepped over the threshold slowly. His nails clicked sharply against the bare hardwood floors. The sound set Donovan's teeth on edge. Instead of sniffing the furniture, the dog immediately began to clear the room. He walked the perimeter, pressing his nose to the baseboards, checking the gap beneath the hallway door, lingering at the sliding glass door that led to the overgrown backyard. He moved with a methodical, ingrained tactical precision that made the hair on Donovan's arms stand up. Once he had circled the entire downstairs, Dutch returned to the living room, walked to the corner farthest from the windows, but with a clear sightline to the front door, and lay down heavily. Donovan stood in the kitchen watching him. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the harsh stubble. What the hell did I just do? He filled a plastic bowl with water and set it on the floor a few feet from the dog. Dutch didn't look at it. Hours passed. Outside, The rain turned into a steady, drumming downpour. Donovan sat on the sofa in the dark, a glass of cheap bourbon resting on his thigh, staring at the television without turning it on. In the corner, the dog remained a dark, motionless lump. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped. Donovan felt the chill seeping through the single-pane windows. He looked over at Dutch. The dog was shivering slightly, a tremor that ran through his scarred flanks. Donovan sighed, his breath loud in the empty room. He set his glass down, grabbed an old wool blanket from the back of the sofa, and walked slowly toward the corner. As he got within 4 feet, a low, vibrating growl started in Dutch's chest. It sounded like an engine idling in the dark. Donovan froze. "Relax," he whispered, his tone level. "I'm just giving you a blanket." He didn't bend over the dog he knew better than to tower over a frightened animal. He knelt to Ordo slowly, keeping his body angled away. He tossed the blanket so it draped over Dutch's hindquarters. The growl subsided, replaced by a wet, heavy sniff. Now that he was close, Donovan noticed the smell again. It wasn't just the shelter stench of bleach and dirty concrete. It was the collar. Up close, the thick leather reeked of mildew, industrial cleaner, and old, oxidized metal. It was far too tight, digging into the thinning fur around the dog's neck. It looked heavy, uncomfortable. "Let me take that off," Donovan murmured, holding his hands out where the dog could see them. Dutch stiffened, his copper eyes widening slightly in the gloom, but he didn't growl. Donovan reached out, his calloused fingers brushing against the stiff, cold leather. The dog flinched, turning his head away, but held his ground. The brass buckle was stiff, fused with grime and age. Donovan had to work his thumb under the strap, feeling the heat of the dog's neck, feeling the rapid, thumping pulse just beneath the skin. With a sharp click, the buckle gave way. Donovan slid the heavy strap off, and Dutch immediately shook his head, his ears flapping loudly in the quiet room. The dog let out a long breath and laid his head back down on his paws, seemingly relieved of the weight. Donovan sat back on his heels, holding the collar. It was thick, double-layered saddle leather, almost black from sweat and dirt. The outside was smooth, devoid of any tags or a nameplate. He was about to toss it onto the coffee table when his thumb caught on a rough texture on the inside of the band. Donovan frowned. He shifted his position, catching the faint yellow light bleeding in from the street lamp outside. He turned the collar inside out. The inner layer of leather was lighter, worn soft from years of friction. Carved into the leather, not stamped by a machine, but violently, unevenly scratched into the material with what looked like the point of a tactical knife, were 3 lines of text. Donovan squinted in the low light. The letters were dark, filled with years of accumulated dirt, making them stand out against the faded leather. He traced the jagged letters with his index finger, his heart suddenly performing a cold, heavy stutter in his chest. C. K. G. Shadow 4. Sangin 14. He found the wire. He kept my boys breathing. Be kind to him. Chief Petty Officer D. Jenkins. DevGru. Donovan stopped breathing. The ambient noise of the rain, the hum of the refrigerator, the clicking of the wall to clock it all dropped away, sucked into a vacuum. He stared at the crude carving, his vision tunneling. DevGru sang in. 204 Bess. Donovan's left hand began to tremble, the familiar icy spike of adrenaline flooding his veins. He knew Sangin. He knew the dirt, the smell of cordite, the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Helmand province. He had been there in 2014, not with Jenkins' unit, but close enough to hear the radio chatter, close enough to know what Shadow 4 meant. It was a clearing element. The guys who went in first, through doors rigged with enough explosives to level a city block. Donovan slowly looked down at the dog. Dutch was looking back at him, the copper eyes reflecting the street lamp. The dog's ear twitched. This wasn't just a washed-out police dog. The shelter had his paperwork wrong. They had his whole life wrong. This dog hadn't failed as a police K-9. He was a war veteran. A Tier 1 asset who had likely seen more combat than half the guys Donovan drank with at the VFW. He had been passed around, caged, and labeled aggressive by people who had no earthly idea what the noise inside his head sounded like. Jenkins was dead. Donovan didn't need to look up the name. He knew how these things ended. The dog had lost his handler, got shipped back stateside, passed to a police department that didn't understand him, and eventually discarded when the trauma became too loud. Donovan gripped the collar so hard his knuckles ached. A profound, crushing wave of grief washed over him, not for himself, but for the 80-pound ghost lying on his floor. Sangin, Donovan whispered into the dark room. At the word, Dutch's head snapped up, his ears pinned forward. A soft, high-pitched whine escaped the dog's throat. He recognized the word. Donovan slowly lowered himself from his knees until he was sitting flat on the hardwood floor, eye level with the dog. He didn't reach out. He just sat there, the space between them suddenly crackling with an unspoken, devastating, shared history. "You found the wire," Donovan said softly, his voice cracking for the first time in a decade. "I know, buddy. I know what it costs." Dutch didn't growl. He didn't pace. For the first time since Donovan had laid eyes on him, the heavy, rigid tension in the dog's shoulders dropped. He let out a long exhale, dragged his body forward across the floorboards, and rested his heavy, scarred chin squarely on Donovan's bad knee. Donovan closed his eyes, resting his hand gently on the back of the dog's neck, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to check the door. Morning didn't bring a miraculous cure. It just brought the harsh, gray light of a Seattle Tuesday, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air of Donovan's living room. He woke up on the floor with a vicious cramp in his neck. His right knee throbbed with a dull, familiar heat. The spot where Dutch's head had rested was empty. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in Donovan's chest. He scrambled up, his hand instinctively reaching for his empty waistband before his brain caught up with his surroundings. He found the German Shepherd in the kitchen. Dutch was sitting rigidly by the back door, staring at the frosted glass. He wasn't scratching or whining. He was simply holding position, waiting for orders. Donovan rubbed the sleep from his eyes, the rough stubble on his jaw scraping his palm. He walked over and poured a cup of kibble into the stainless steel bowl. The dry food rattled loudly. Dutch didn't even flinch. He didn't look away from the door. "Eat," Donovan commanded, keeping his voice flat. Nothing. The dog was a statue of muscle and matted fur. Donovan remembered the shelter manager's warning. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. He guards his food. It wasn't guarding. Donovan realized it with a sudden sinking clarity. It was conditioning. A high-level working dog wouldn't touch a meal unless cleared by his handler. And Jenkins was gone. The people who had tried to adopt Dutch before didn't know the codes. They just put food down and expected a traumatized soldier to act like a golden retriever. Donovan walked over to the bowl. He scooped up a handful of the greasy, fish-smelling kibble. He walked back to the dog, crouched down, and held his hand out flat. "Break," Donovan said sharply. Dutch's ears swiveled. He looked at Donovan, then down at the hand. Slowly, the dog lowered his muzzle. He didn't snatch. His teeth never grazed Donovan's skin. He gently lipped the kibble from the palm, chewing methodically. Donovan fed him the entire bowl by hand, handful by handful, his knees protesting the whole time. It was tedious. It took 20 minutes. But by the end, Dutch licked his chops and offered a single, heavy tail thump against the linoleum. They needed a routine. Structure was the only thing that kept the wiring from shorting out. Donovan drove to a tactical supply store and bought a heavy-duty working harness, no more collars around the neck. The harness had a handle on the back, solid brass D-rings, and wide, padded chest straps. When he slipped it over Dutch's head and clicked the heavy cobra buckles into place, the dog physically transformed. His posture straightened. The limp in his hindquarters seemed to vanish. The harness was a uniform. He was on the clock. Their first walk was a disaster. They made it 2 blocks down the wet suburban sidewalk. The air smelled of damp pine needles and exhaust fumes. Donovan kept a short leash, holding the tension. Dutch walked slightly ahead, scanning alleys and parked cars. A rusted box truck rattled past them, hitting a deep pothole. The resulting bang of metal on asphalt sounded exactly like a distant mortar tube firing. Donovan dropped his coffee. The paper cup hit the sidewalk, splashing dark liquid over his boots. His heart slammed against his ribs, his breath catching in his throat as his body prepared to dive for cover. But Dutch was faster. The dog spun, not fleeing, but putting his 80-pound body directly between Donovan and the street. He dropped into a defensive crouch, a guttural, terrifying roar ripping from his throat. He was ready to tear apart whatever was attacking his handler. A woman walking a poodle on the other side of the street screamed and yanked her dog behind a hedge. Donovan couldn't breathe. The ringing in his ears drowned out the traffic. But feeling the immense, vibrating power of the dog at the end of the leash pulled him back. He wasn't in Helmand. He was in Seattle. The threat was a pothole. He didn't yell, he didn't yank the leash. He stepped forward, sliding his hand down the nylon strap until he grabbed the handle on Dutch's back. He gripped it hard, letting the dog feel his solid, unmoving presence. "We're clear," Donovan said. His voice shook slightly, but he forced it down into his chest. "Stand down. We're clear." Dutch stopped barking. He stood up, chest heaving, his copper eyes darting wildly. He looked up at Donovan. "Clear," Donovan repeated, tapping the dog's side twice. Dutch shook himself violently, the metal buckles on his harness jingling, and stepped back to Donovan's side. They were both sweating. They both looked unhinged to the neighborhood. Donovan picked up his crushed coffee cup, his hands trembling. "Good boy," he muttered. They turned around and walked home. 3 months bled into the Seattle autumn. The rain became a permanent fixture, drumming against the windows and turning the neglected backyard into a swamp. The house started to change. It didn't look like a magazine cover, but the empty beer bottles were gone, replaced by a massive sack of premium dog food and a stack of clean towels by the back door for muddy paws. Donovan shaved every 3 days now. He had to. When he took Dutch out to the park at 5 a.m., the only time it was empty enough to let the dog off the leash, he couldn't look like a vagrant. They had an understanding. Dutch still didn't play fetch. If Donovan threw a tennis ball, the dog would simply watch it bounce away, then look at Donovan with an expression of profound judgment. Instead, Donovan bought a thick, 3-foot-long jute tug toy. When the tension in the house got too thick, when Donovan's leg ached and his temper frayed, or when Dutch started pacing the hallways, his nails clicking a manic rhythm, Donovan would grab the tug. They fought for it. It was silent, brutal, physical exertion. Donovan would brace his boots against the floorboards, wrapping his hands in the thick material, and Dutch would thrash, pulling with the raw, terrifying power of a predator. It was the only time the dog fully let go. When they were both exhausted, lungs burning, Donovan would let him win. Dutch would carry the saliva-soaked prize to his corner, lay his head on it, and sleep. The breakthrough didn't happen in the daylight. It happened at 3 a.m. Donovan was dreaming of the sand. It was always the sand, choking his throat, burying him while the radio crackled with screaming voices. He was thrashing in the sheets, his throat raw from trying to shout a warning that wouldn't come out. He woke up with a gasp, his eyes wide, staring at the dark ceiling. His t-shirt was soaked in a freezing sweat. He lay there, paralyzed, waiting for the phantom echoes of gunfire to fade. Then he felt the weight. Something immense and suffocatingly heavy was pressing down on his chest. Donovan panicked for a split second, bringing his fists up before his hands met thick, coarse fur. It was Dutch. The dog wasn't just on the bed. He had crawled entirely over Donovan's torso, laying his massive 80-pound frame horizontally across Donovan's chest and stomach. He wasn't licking Donovan's face or whining. He was simply applying pressure. Deep, immovable pressure. Dutch's chin was resting heavily on Donovan's shoulder. The dog's heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm against Donovan's frantic ribs. He found the wire. He kept my boys breathing. Dutch knew exactly what he was doing. He was neutralizing the threat. He was grounding the casualty. Donovan didn't push him off. He slowly moved his arms from a defensive posture and wrapped them around the dog's thick neck, burying his face in the coarse fur that smelled of wet earth and dust. For the first time in 8 years, the tears came. They were hot and silent, soaking into the dog's coat. Dutch didn't move. He just let out a long, heavy sigh, absorbing the grief, anchoring the man to the mattress, until the trembling finally stopped. The next morning, the rain broke. Donovan sat on the peeling paint of his back porch. The air was frigid, smelling sharply of wet cedar and decaying leaves. He held a mug of black coffee, watching the steam curl into the cold air. Dutch was lying in the damp grass a few feet away. He wasn't wearing the harness. He wasn't wearing the heavy leather collar. He was bare. A squirrel darted across the top of the fence, its claws scrabbling loudly against the wood. 6 months ago, Dutch would have charged the fence line, tearing up the grass, entering a blind frenzy to eliminate the breach in the perimeter. Today, the dog lifted his heavy, scarred head. His torn left ear flopped. The right one pivoted toward the noise. He watched the squirrel scurry out of sight. Then he looked back at Donovan. Donovan took a slow sip of his coffee. He nodded once. "We're clear." Dutch let out a grunt, lowered his head back onto his front paws, and closed his eyes. The perimeter was secure. They could finally rest. If Dutch and Donovan's journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who understands the unseen scars of service. It helps us bring more deeply human, grounded stories to light. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a part of our ongoing series. Let us know down in the comments what you thought of Donovan's decision. Your support means the absolute world to us.